I wanted to do it respectfully and kind of remembrance of those here that lost their lives.
That's my buddy CJ, who's a frequent guest on the podcast.
I didn't want it to come across as any type of appropriation or something that wasn't appropriate.
Discussions about how to show deference and respect to a culture aren't uncommon conversations anymore, but they don't usually occur on the edge of a cornfield in southeast Wyoming. One of my favorite movies, called Little Evil, features two characters arguing, scared to death, in a cornfield at night, and one of them says to the other one, "Name one good thing that's ever happened in a cornfield." I can't think of anything good that's ever happened in a cornfield. But on this episode of That Doesn't Happen Every Day, the podcast in which we talk to everyday people about things that don't normally happen every day, we talk about something very, very bad that happened in the cornfield we're standing by 171 years ago. We start the story in the most everyday place I can think of. It's among the displays at the Museum and Visitor Center at Fort Laramie National Historic Site.
Looking at a gold case pocket watch. It's also in really good condition.
Fort Laramie was named after a French or French-Canadian trapper, Jacques Laramie. I hope I'm saying that right. People in early Wyoming, for some reason, loved Jacques so much that they named lots of stuff after him. There's the city of Laramie, the county of Laramie, Laramie Peak, there's a Laramie River, of course Fort Laramie, and in true Wyoming fashion, most of these places are pretty far from each other.
What's a brevet, Second Lieutenant? Is it promotable?
The problem with trying to understand history isn't just that it happened a long time ago, it's that even the language used is different.
And then what's a parlay?
Negotiations, I think, would be the more modern phrase for it.
The uniforms and clothing that people wore look more like costumes than anything we're familiar with on a day-to-day basis now.
What's with their hats?
So that's a shako, which is a different style uniform hat.
We walk past a headless old doll, which in true That Doesn't Happen Everyday fashion, I insist is...
The haunted doll.
It's not, by the way.
It's beheaded.
That still doesn't mean it's haunted. My joking stops when we see something that actually would be worth being afraid of.
Says War Club, Dakota, pecked in groundstone quartzite head.
It's very thin, and at the end is a big fat rock about the size of a sledgehammer's head. When I look at it, I think about how fast it would move through the air, and how hard that big stone head would come down on, well, someone else's head.
1853, so I mean, this would have been used in that battle.
It serves as a reminder of why the site was a fort in the first place.
Fort Laramie was the principal military fort in the middle of the most dangerous part of the Oregon route.
That's U.S. Park Ranger Jaeger Held, who you'll hear from intermittently throughout the episode. If you're like me, if you even remember hearing anything about Fort Laramie, it was probably when you had the option of pulling the wagon over and talking to the locals or buying more ammunition when you played Oregon Trail in school. Originally it was just a fur trading post, but as more and more people headed west to Oregon and California and Utah, the U.S. Army was sent to garrison the site and help and protect immigrants on the trail. CJ explains that the importance of what's now just a collection of old buildings really far from everything else can be seen in historic maps.
You see a city like St. Louis, and there'll be this big dot on the map, and then they'll have Fort Laramie, and it's as big a dot as like New York or St. Louis, because, you know, not that it was that big, but I think it goes to show that it was the only thing to put on the map out here, where you could have bought supplies. Maybe you could have visited with a trained physician for the Army. You could have restocked stuff. You could have sent a letter home. So, and the Army provided, as the story will tell, the illusion of security at that time.
Park Ranger Jarrett Carpenter talks about this illusion of security.
You just had the 1851 treaty that this place helped negotiate just a few miles from here. And so the thought of like being attacked here or really dealing with violence from American Indians at this time period really wasn't in the mind of the military.
Just the same, though, considering that Fort Laramie is over 500 miles from the next biggest fort in Kansas, you'd think that they'd have a lot of troops, right?
You know, there's only about 70 troops here in 1854.
To be fair, unlike today's modern army that has almost 1 million troops divided between active duty, guard, and reservists, Back then, the U.S. Army only had about 10,000 men total.
It is definitely a very important part of this story that this fort of around 75 soldiers from a single company is left in command of a second lieutenant, Hugh Fleming, and a brevet second lieutenant, John Lawrence Grattan.
If you aren't familiar with Army ranks, the Army is commanded by commissioned officers. The highest ones are generals, while the very new ones are lieutenants. One more thing to consider about this developing situation. If you played Oregon Trail, you'll remember a graphic coming up of Fort Laramie when you got there, and it featured a stone wall, like a castle, all around the fort, and there are teepees and wagons flanking the wall. That image isn't inaccurate, but it doesn't show Fort Laramie during the events we're talking about. Before the Army ever took over what became Fort Laramie, it had been a series of civilian trade forts that did in fact have walls, and Jaeger says that's what the Oregon Trail game is depicting. However, after the Army took over the site in 1849, it never built a wall around the entire fort, leaving most of its buildings exposed to who or whatever might come across the prairie. The only thing at Fort Laramie that had a wall around it during the events we're talking about was the remaining civilian trappers post called Fort John, which did in fact have an adobe wall, but it didn't encircle the entire military installation, just the immediate area around that old post.
There were plans initially drawn up to build a wall around Fort Laramie, but just mainly because of expense and convenience, it never came to fruition.
By August of 1854, the usual summer traffic of immigrants going west had slowed down, and now most of the remaining ones going by the fort were LDS, or members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, formerly known as Mormons. In most cases, they were only trying to get to Salt Lake City, which was a lot closer than where the other immigrants were going, so they didn't have to leave as soon. In one of these LDS groups was a Danish immigrant named Christian Larson. He had a cow that wandered into a Lakota village near the fort.
It was a big encampment of natives, and part of what kept him here is they were waiting for those annuities. They were kind of waiting for the treaty goods that were promised to them by the U.S. government to be delivered.
Those provisions, they are late, so they are essentially starving. And so there's already this tension of like survivability by the Lakota too. That cow is known to be injured in some way, and it slowly migrates into a village and is killed by a man there. 8 miles from Fort Laramie. And then later that, I believe the next day, Larson comes in and tells the leading officer here, Fleming, about it. And about the same time, Conquering Bear, who's the leader of the Lakota village, comes in too to report the incident to try to minimize conflict. Actually, Conquering Bear does a pretty good job minimizing the conflict, to my knowledge, up to that point. And so Fleming actually isn't going to do anything about it. Larson, the Mormon man, wants $25. Conquering Bear's offered, hey, you can take a cow, you can take a horse. He's like, no, $25. And after really that, like, Fleming is not going to deal with it. And that's when you have John L. Grattan kind of enter the scene. 24 years old, he's, we like to say fairly fresh out at West Point, and he is really gung-ho to, attack some American Indians, essentially. He seems, in our today's terms, very racist. And Grattan, from my knowledge, he had just really started drinking for the first time out here. And he starts to tell Fleming, like, hey, we should go take care of this and not wait for the American Indian agent. And that's where Fleming is, like, kind of bodes to this man that's not in command, which is really interesting. That's how the story starts. After Fleming gives Grattan the A-OK to, get men together, asks for volunteers, which he's not supposed to do. He was supposed to handpick them. And so he asks for volunteers, gathers up the men right here at the sutler's store.
Grattan had attempted to get an ordnance sergeant to go with him, but he declined. More about that in a minute. Instead, the party was joined by a different sergeant, a corporal, and 27 other enlisted men, and a civilian translator named Lucien Auguste.
And so they were assembled right here about mid-afternoon on August 19th, and then would have headed out 8 miles east of here.
The fact that Grattan had poked Mr. Auguste with his officer's sword to get him going outside the sutler's store, where we taped these interviews, sets the tone of what it was like dealing with him. In fact, it kind of says a lot about both of them. Another account says that Grattan took a Gus bottle of liquor which he'd been drinking on the ride over to the Lakota village and broke it. Despite Grattan's efforts, by the time they got close to that village, the party's only translator was now drunk. Instead of riding right into the village, which was said to have had over 4,000 residents camped there, the soldiers actually stopped at a trading post on the edge of it. Grattan talked with a civilian who worked there named James Bordeaux.
What we know is that Grattan asked Bordeaux, the post trader, if he could speak with Conquering Bear, the chief. And he does. Conquering Bear tells him it's probably not going to go well. I think there's conflicting reports, but there's clearly some confusion as to exactly why he's there. Were they going to kill the guy they were looking for? Were they just arresting him?
A messenger from the village came to Grattan saying that High Forehead, the man believed to have killed the cow, would rather die than go with the soldiers. Matters were further complicated by the fact that High Forehead was just visiting from another tribe and wasn't under the jurisdiction, for lack of a better way of putting it, of Chief Conquering Bear.
The interpreter, August Lucien, had been drinking. He was not well liked by these natives on a good day. He antagonized them. He called them women. He called them, we're going to kill you today. And he was holding bullets up. These are for you. So he really was antagonizing them. And, this is my opinion. I think Grattan probably realized that this was not going well. That's why they sent for Bordeaux several times to come talk to the Indians. And on the last time, Bordeaux won't come. He runs and goes back to his post because he knows something bad's going to happen.
Grattan, instead of waiting for his interpreter to sober up, or perhaps seeing if he could arrange a parley with Conquering Bear or even the offending Lakota back at the fort, or at least somewhere away from the large body of Lakota, led his small group of troops and 2 cannon right into the village. Much of this information comes from Douglas R. Cubbison's 2016 article about the incident, which I'll link in the description. He says while Grattan was, by all accounts, a bit too aggressive and intense, it should be noted that about a year before this incident, Grattan's commanding officer, Lieutenant Fleming, who had actually started West Point with Grattan at the same time, had led a slightly smaller group of soldiers into a camp of the same tribe in search of people believed to have attacked a local ferry. In that incident, fighting broke out and 3 members of the tribe were killed while the army escaped without any casualties. With knowledge of that prior incident, it's likely that Grattan felt that, dealing with 4,000 people with just 30 of your own, including yourself, was maybe not that unreasonable. What Grattan didn't know, or perhaps ignored, was that when Fleming fought with the village before, most of the warriors were away on hunting parties. But that wasn't the case now. According to Cubbison's article, Grattan marshaled his troops in a line facing Conquering Bear's lodge, and also had the 2 cannons aimed at it. Conquering Bear repeated his offer of offering a different animal in exchange for the one that was killed, and then supposedly Grattan pulled out a gold pocket watch and said it was getting late and he couldn't wait any longer.
Once Conquering Bear and John Grattan are done talking and it's decided that John Grattan is going to attempt to arrest this guy, Grattan places his men to attention.
Cubbison said that a man on the right end of the line fired. Conquering Bear again apparently sued for peace, and then the left side of the line also started firing, along with both cannon, which fortunately had been aimed too high and ripped through the upper part of the lodges. Grattan was swiftly killed, and the remaining corporal and sergeant attempted to lead the soldiers in a fighting retreat. According to Cubbison, within 10 minutes, almost all of the soldiers were killed. Some accounts say that the process maybe took closer to a half hour.
And so there was also, of course, mutilation of the Grattan dead, although Lieutenant Grattan was identified because of some of his personal effects on his body.
Remember how at the start of the episode we saw that gold pocket watch in great condition? It wasn't Grattan's watch. I don't know whose it was, but it really would have added to this episode had it been. Chief Conquering Bear would die from his wounds days later. Remember how I said almost all of the soldiers were killed?
Private John Cuddy, the survivor, he would actually make multiple attempts to get back here and turn around multiple times.
Imagine seeing more than 30 people killed and then fleeing for your life as an entire small town wants to kill you.
It would be a day about until he would reach the fort again.
Private Cuddy died of his wounds at the fort.
Second Lieutenant Hugh Fleming was essentially fully expecting an attack on Fort Laramie itself, which could have happened. Another detachment of over 30 men is actually working at the government farm where they would harvest hay for their livestock, which is over a dozen miles north of Fort Laramie. Fleming had to send an urgent courier rider up to the government farm to immediately order all of those troops back into the fort.
While waiting for reinforcements, the soldiers, totaling less than a baker's dozen, piled into the original fur trade fort inside of Fort Laramie.
Now, Fort John is a pretty large fort and has large walls, so they would have defended that area decently, but with 12 men, I don't know how you're going to keep up.
Members of the tribe overwhelmed the Bordeaux trading site where Grattan had asked for help from Jim Bordeaux. Bordeaux and his native wife were unharmed, but just about everything at the fort was taken. Likewise, Fort Laramie's animal herd, though the few remaining soldiers were also left alone.
Leaders among the Lakota people who were the ones who really stopped additional violence from occurring.
It was the biggest defeat that the U.S. Army had suffered to Native people west of the Mississippi to that date. The death of so many American soldiers sparked what would be known as the First Sioux War, resulting in a punitive expedition in Nebraska, killing 86 Lakota and capturing 70 at the Battle of Ash Hollow, also known as the Harney Massacre, where General William Harney would earn the name the Butcher. CJ and I leave the settler store where Grattan had left, but instead of heading off to battle, we walk back to the officers' quarters.
So this is where Grattan lived, and the thing is, I mean, you know, it's pretty. It's white, it has windows.
The officers' quarters before us doesn't look like it would hold up well against an attack, and thankfully, because it wasn't attacked after Grattan was, it's Wyoming's oldest building, completed in 1849. We walk up onto the second-floor balcony and look out over the fort while we listen to the hiss of a sprinkler on the parade grounds.
Now sit on the upper porch where Grattan and Fleming and probably others certainly sat and looked out over the parade field on, a hot Fort Laramie, Wyoming day. And you have to think about what it was like when he came out here because, he was from New Hampshire, grew up there. He actually, reading, into his background, he came from a more modest or poorer family. His dad, I believe, was a carpenter, so he goes to West Point. And this was Grattan's first assignment after West Point. So you can just imagine what it would have been like to grow up in New Hampshire, go to West Point, and then you come out here, right? That would have been one heck of, I imagine, a thrilling experience. And probably, I doubt maybe they would have admitted it, but kind of terrifying experience or scary experience to be this far from everything you knew.
Grattan doesn't seem like a likable person. In fact, he was called rash and impulsive, almost beyond belief, by Lieutenant Fleming, who honestly should have pulled rank and not let him go out to the Lakota camp. However, the best part of podcasting has been to stand and sit and look out over the same places where the people we're talking about once stood and sat and looked out. It's like a chance to really try to see what they might have seen or even felt what they felt, whether the person was likable or not.
Now we're walking into Old Bedlam.
Inside of a bedroom where a glass panel blocks the doorway, we see two beds with animal furs for blankets on either side of a small table covered in bottles and playing cards. And then, on the far wall, is a fireplace.
The Grattan signature at the top of the fireplace, it's a recreation, but they put it back where it would have originally been, where it was recorded having been.
Less than a year after this 24-year-old lieutenant left his signature high up on that wall, probably using a chair or a crate, he would die a violent death and set off a series of attacks and violence on a frontier he'd just barely gotten to. When I saw Grattan's signature, I was reminded of a time in basic training when I was on a guard tower watching for enemies that weren't there, when the kid next to me pulled out a ballpoint pen and started to add to the existing graffiti on the wooden railing of the tower. The military was, and still is, home to a lot of graffiti, despite all the supposed discipline and control. You see it in the drawings and jokes written on the plastic walls of porta-johns with Sharpies, and signatures on elevator shafts that lead to the control facilities to launch nuclear missiles. There's something about that memory of a bored private in boot camp doing almost the same thing that a West Point grad did on the wall of his quarters just 6 weeks before he rode out and died with his whole platoon, that makes this story of young West Point officers and Lakota warriors and Mormon cows seem a lot more real. We walked to the site of where the schoolhouse had been built sometime after the Grattan fight and read a historic marker about school life at the fort.
It also says classrooms were cramped, spartanly furnished, and dangerous on at least one occasion. The post surgeon reported in 1883 a stray shot fired by some man at target practice in rear of the company's barracks passed through the schoolhouse door and slightly injured the daughter of the ordnance sergeant. That's your boy, CJ.
Snyder, yeah.
Sergeant Snyder was the sergeant who declined the invitation to go to the village. He continued to serve in the Army and live at Fort Laramie for decades after the fight. To complete the final leg of our journey, we get in CJ's car, leave the fort, and then immediately get lost.
There's the river. It's got to be closer to the river.
It's weird that something so important and tragic happened in a place that now seems forgotten. There aren't any signs pointing the way or tourist stands as we head towards the battle site, or at least try to. In fact, we're swallowed up in a maze of canals that cut through agricultural fields. The whole vibe is less Dances with Wolves and more Children of the Corn. Eventually, CJ finds what we're looking for.
There is a stone monument here, and the monument says, Sioux Indians massacred 29 soldiers with their officer, Brevet Second Lieutenant L. Grattan, on August 19th, 1854.
CJ points out over a field of corn stalks taller than I am to the actual site of the battle, about a half a mile from where we're standing. One of the definitions of the word massacre that Merriam-Webster includes is a complete destruction, and the Cambridge Dictionary includes to kill many people in a short period of time. However, both sources also include definitions that mention killing defenseless people or people not involved in fighting. So perhaps the word isn't the best suited for an incident where armed men did go out in a military posture with artillery, but got wiped out. Don't get me wrong, my heart goes out to every one of the enlisted soldiers and the Lakota killed in the fight, but I could see how some people would say that isn't the best term to describe what happened.
It is kind of sobering to be standing here and just see this cornfield and know this event that kicked off the First Plains Indian War happened right where we're standing. I kind of feel nebulously the presence of the history, and it's like in my mind's eye I can kind of picture when I read about it what might have occurred that day. Obviously it's my imagination, but it paints its own picture in the mind's eye, and it's like I can feel, I believe, the weight of history there. But that's me. How do you feel when you visit?
Yeah, I don't know. I want to believe that, maybe that's why I like ghosts so much, is the idea that something hasn't forgotten, that there's something that lives on, that reaches out to us still.
I brought today, call me maybe sentimental, but I brought a flag to place here, a small American flag at the memorial, in honor of those soldiers in the U.S. Army who lost their lives in this battle, in this defeat. And I think it's important to remember them. But I also wanted to, in good faith, remember the natives that lost their lives here too. And so I really tried to do my research. And what I found was that just leaving a little bit of tobacco and a little bit of white cloth, all like cotton, natural materials, is kind of a little peace offering. That's something that I thought was important, was to remember both sides that lost their lives in the
CJ places the offering of the tobacco on the base of the monument, then plants a small American flag in the grass next to it, and then he plays taps on his phone as the sun sets. I'd like to thank my friend CJ Young for making this episode possible and all of the research he did. I also want to thank Park Rangers Jaeger and Jarrett for their research and for their interviews. The opinions, beliefs, and theories expressed by people on this podcast are strictly of those giving them and are not necessarily the opinions, beliefs, or theories of Fort Laramie or the National Park Service. In addition to information taken from the Grattan Fight, Prelude to a Generation of War by Douglas R. Cubison, other information about this incident also came from All Because of a Mormon Cow, historical accounts of the Grattan Massacre, 1854 through 1855, edited by John D. McDermott, R. Eli Paul, and Sandra J. Lowry. Another book you might check out about the incident is called The Grattan Massacre by Lloyd E. McCann. If you've enjoyed this episode of the show, please do a search for That Doesn't Happen Every Day podcast. Every day is 2 words in this case, and you can listen to every past episode I've ever done completely for free. On the page is a link if you would like to donate to the show, but please don't feel obligated at all. Thank you to KHOL in Jackson for playing the show, and thank you for listening. I hope to have another episode to you in about 2 weeks.